On November 1st, 1916, something utterly inexplicable befell the 13th Battalion of the Pennine Fusiliers. They vanished without a trace, taking with them half a mile of the Somme battlefield, including trenches, mud, a Sopwith camel and a tank. Transported to a nightmarish alien world, Thomas Only Atkins and his comrades found themselves in a fight for survival against the man-eating plants, ferocious beasts and the eerie insect-like chats. Yet the most insidious threat lay within their own ranks. A sinister, arcane force began to take hold. In this episode, we're looking at Black Hand Gang, No Man's World by Pat Kelleher. Welcome to Oh, What a Lovely Podcast. I'm Angus Wallace, and with me, as ever, are Jessica Meyer and Chris Kepshall. First published in 2011, Black Hand Gang is a fantasy sci-fi novel. Though looking at Amazon, it sells well in the genres of ghost horror and Space Marine. I assume Space Marine is some sort of spin-off of Games Workshop's Warhammer 40,000.
Yeah.
One reviewer suggests the book is reminiscent of Brian Aldiss, Harry Harrison and Edgar Rice Burroughs. I'd add it struck me as very reminiscent of H.P. Lovecraft's cosmic horror, or one of his acolytes, perhaps Brian Lumbley. On Amazon, the book scores 3.8 stars out of 5. We tried this last time. I'm not sure quite how well it worked. Want to try a one-word review? I'm happy to go first. I thought it was fun.
I would wholeheartedly agree. I mean, it's my one-word review, and I mean this in the best possible way. It's pulpy.
I'd absolutely go with pulpy. Okay, this is when I make my admission. I didn't finish this. I got about halfway through the first book. I downloaded the whole it's a trilogy. And I downloaded the whole trilogy onto my Kindle and read it on the plane and reached a point where I stopped being able to tell the characters apart. All I wanted to do was go and read some H.G. Wells. And I decided that at that point, yeah, I absolutely agree with the Lovecraft comparison, incidentally, Angus. But actually, I think I want some philosophical sci-fi, please, which it is not. So hard to do a one-word review on that basis. And I feel badly because I didn't dislike it as much as I disliked last month's book. I didn't think it was that bad. So my one-word review, I think, would be generic, and generic to the point where I was struggling to stay engaged. I've read all this before. There's some lovely touches. The opening where the author's talking about setting it up as an actual First World War regimental history is brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. And as someone who lives in the Pennines, he's clearly basing it on the Duke of Wellington's regiment. That bit was a lot of fun. And then when they left Earth, the jokes didn't follow.
Well, he sets it up as a found footage story, doesn't he? They find the footage in the Harcourt crater, some First World War footage, which is going to then tell the story of the regiment that disappeared and how he sort of sets the story up as one of the big mysteries with the Angel of Mons, Phantom Archers, Crucified Canadians, and it has a certain whiff of authenticity. It had me going, is there a Harcourt crater? Let me just Google that. Have I missed this somewhere?
I actually had to Google the village that he claimed it was based on.
Broughtonshire. And indeed, because he writes it, the village, they're raised in Broughtonshire, and he's writing it from that village. You get this feeling that there is a sort of a whiff of a local historian who's piecing all together. I thought it was a brilliant setup.
Yeah, and I loved it. And that had me really gripped. But then the minute that it disappeared, all of that stopped. All that setup stopped. And even the way they were writing about the recording of the film, because they keep telling us what's being filmed, that's written as an omniscient narrator, not as a historian analyzing the film. And I did keep thinking as I was reading this, I really, really, really need to get hold of Chris's book on Star Wars and read the introduction to see how to do this properly to create this imagined historical practice. It stops being good history in that sense. It starts out as really, really fun, fictionalized historical practice, but I don't think he manages to carry that through. And that was what was interesting me, because I'm not a sci-fi fan in general. So it lost my interest at that point, I think.
To slightly break the found footage concept, from a purely practical point of view, these cameras wouldn't be shooting sound. So he is indeed putting words into other people's mouths. The found footage would only show you glimpses of what they saw. But
he does claim that they're sort of memoirs, and it's not just film; it's their papers.
There's letters and that in there as well, because only Atkins is writing letters throughout the book. So
there's plenty of pictures of depictions of stretcher bearers and casualty clearing stations. Did they pass muster, Jessica?
Yes. I wasn't sure about they clearly needed to have a female ambulance driver, a matron, and a nurse close enough to the front line. I thought they handled that quite well, because they get lost, and that's why they're in the sector that disappears. I didn't quite believe in their sort of class characterization. It kept sort of flicking in and out. I mean, that was the thing. I couldn't tell the characters apart because, again, the characters were very flat, and that's the problem with generic fiction, right? Really good generic fiction does proper characterization, so you can tell the different characters apart. This one was erring towards so we need a padre, we need an upper class nurse, we need a not very competent senior officer, without actually giving them enough of an additional characterization beyond that to make them distinctive. So their interactions with other characters didn't really feel like they had a lot of meaning. I couldn't tell where things were going, really.
Well, see, it all starts out quite standard First World War stuff, people buried alive, trenches, mud, and then suddenly it gets all a bit Dennis Wheatley, and the devil rides out as Lieutenant Jeffries is making his salt symbols on the floor, and I just had this flashback of the devil rides out there. And I couldn't understand why Jeffries has he has a private dugout. He's only a lieutenant, but he has his own private dugout to carry out his special rites. And coming to the three female characters, I found it slightly amusing that Edith's the debutante who speaks perfectly well. But then you have Nellie, who we can clearly tell is working class because she speaks with some slightly strange Cockney estuary accent. All right, lover kind of thing going on.
But the thing is, so she's the ambulance driver, which means she's Fanny, the first aid nursing yeomanry. The problem is Fanny was the most upper middle class of all the Williams women's auxiliaries, because originally they were set up. Were they set up in the South African War? Certainly shortly after, but the idea was that they would ride on horseback, taking medical supplies to the men. They were a nursing yeomanry, and they were supposed to supply their own horses. These were very nice girls in Fanny, who then went on to train as mechanics. And as the war went on, the Red Cross was recruiting more and more working class women who then were training as mechanics and were training as ambulance drivers. And there's absolutely not an issue with an ambulance driver being working class. But the Fanny Association threw me slightly.
I'm not sure it would pass the Bechdel test, which asks whether it features two female characters of a conversation about something other than men. I'm not quite sure we're there yet.
To be fair, I don't think you can apply the Bechdel test to any form of First World War fiction. We've certainly reviewed things before where there have been no women at all. So.
Well, Edith is there to flirt with one of the common privates.
Yeah, after the tank driver gets horribly eaten.
And is it Edith? I can't remember which one does some screaming, which again is very, very sort of Hammer House. And she's also there to drive forward because she'd been to a debutante ball or something where she'd met Lieutenant Jeffries. So they're there to sort of drive the plot without really being involved with it.
Yeah, as it turns out that Jeffries, surprisingly, is not what he seems.
We perhaps need an explainer because we've been alluding to this. So that the basic idea is that Lieutenant Jeffries is an occultist who, on the eve of battle, does some arcane rite, which accidentally transfers a metre square mile of the Somme battlefield to some unknown world. So there's a paradise that they're dropped into, but there's sort of a mile sort of sized hall of the Somme dropped on it.
And it's very not a paradise.
And it's not really paradise. I was going to say all sorts of evil beasts. But So can I just, because I didn't finish, it was his occultism that is the cause. Do we learn that that's the cause? Because it wasn't clear to the point where I got into.
So he was trying to do this to kind of commune with a particular very Lovecraftian god, and they all get transported to this weird alien world, and eventually some of them get, including Jeffries, get taken prisoner by the bugs. And through that process, he discovers that a long time ago, some other humans had tried to do a similar ritual to the same god and also ended up there.
John Dee, isn't it, who tends to come up a lot in this kind of genre.
And there's a comet in the sky who may or may not be the god, and it crashes somewhere on the planet, and he finds a map with like the name of the god here. So that sets up the next couple of books, but it almost certainly is his ritual.
So does the humans who are there already,
they're kind of Hermans, or no, not Hermans because that's too German. Erman.
Yeah, the Erman. They were from the previous ritual.
Yeah, they're probably descendants from the long ago humans who came.
I found them very problematic in a sort of classic sci-fi colonialist sense.
Well, it's kind of a Robinson Crusoe moment where they're struggling to survive, and up comes Man Friday, who is, I forgot, is he Napu? Is that what he's called?
Yeah, they call him Napu.
Who demonstrates how to survive on this world. So again, you're drawing on some other different genre to explain, this is how you're going to survive. At which point you get this weird sort of muscular Christianity, British imperialism kicks in of, we're here to show the heathen how to live.
But it's very aware of that.
Well, it is, but it's somehow not aware enough to give the Erman character beyond the reading by the central characters as lesser humans. They are very much like Nellie's weird vernacular, class vernacular. They are given a limited grasp of
vocabulary.
Yeah. So they are, and there's no indication that they've got a civilization at all. So I found it really quite uncomfortable.
So later in the book, it turns out that the bugs basically control them with pheromones, and like every day they kind of dose them back up again to make them basically worker ants.
They're sort of slaves, aren't they?
Yeah.
To the chat in their city. What amused me is this sort of old soul. There's a quote, I think, about old soldiers who'd served in India expressed their opinion. It was only right and natural to find someone who they were superior. So you give the working class soldier someone to lord over.
Which is fine to state, but then to not show these characters as anything other than someone to lord over.
So I can't remember, because I've decided I'm going to read the other two books, reread the other two books, and my memory is that some of this starts to appear in the next two, but I can't. Again, I'm thinking back like 13, 14 years to when I last read them.
Well, there's not really a direct interaction with the rest of them en masse, is there? They're kind of only deal with as individuals, and then when they go to rescue, so the chat come and capture some of the British troops and the nurses and take them back to their city. And so they decide, the British then, of course, the surviving British who had been away foraging decide to go and rescue their comrades and take the tank Ivanhoe with them. I can't remember what the plane's doing at this point. It's interesting that they managed to land with a tank, which it must be one of the very few on the Western Front because of the dates.
It's November 1916, isn't it?
We are told that it is one of the first, and when it appears on the Western Front, those reactions seemed fair enough.
Yeah. And the plane at that point is they're fermenting like the fruit to make petrol to make the plane fly. And at the kind of the culmination of the book, when they're desperately trying to get back to their own trenches and they're being kind of like harried on all sides by monsters, and like then the plane comes and like strafes the aliens, and it's a big hero moment.
Oh, so we're getting into Second World War imagery then.
Long-term listeners will know that I have very particular geeky tastes in regards to film, TV, literature, and there is an element that I wonder if Pat Kelleher wrote these books with just like a picture of me on his desk to be like, I'm going to aim this squarely at Chris because he's going to eat this up.
I actually read it and thought, I wonder if he's read Charley's War. and then went back and did some Googling, and it turns out he works for Rebellion, who published 2000 AD. So I suspect he's fully aware of Charley's War.
Rebellion own the IP for this. So I had a brief conversation with him on Twitter recently, because I don't want to do spoilers for the listeners, because if they want to go and read the trilogy, but the end of the trilogy is not the end of, it doesn't wrap up the story of what's happening. So I'm pretty sure he would like to go back and do more in the future, but Rebellion own the IP for it. So whether or not that happens, it's been quite a long time now since these books come out. And I'm just thinking back to Angus, your one word review of it being fun. From my personal point of view, I think these are the most fun book we possibly read for this, because it is just absolutely balmy, and it's pulpy, and it's nonsensical in points, but it's self-aware nonsensicalness, because of course it's weird. You've just put a bunch of First World War soldiers in an alien planet, so of course it's going to be tropey in that sense and the like. And there's a glossary of terms at the back of the book, but in previous ones we've been like, they should include like some sign that they've done some of their research and where it's come from.
Oh, there's no question he's done his research, and actually the language is clever. I mean, all the naming of various things on this new planet, which is very much out of the First World War, and a real understanding of the language that soldiers used in the First World War. I wasn't quite as convinced by Thomas Atkin's letters.
I know they were tedious.
And soldiers' letters can be very tedious, but yeah, they hadn't quite got the tone, I don't think. But I'm in a slightly unusual position. I've read more soldiers' letters than most people have. So.
There was lots of use of sort of slang with flickerwallers, battle ballers, devil dodger, which I quite like for the Padre, sort of thrown in.
There was a tendency to overuse, because they kept what's their reference for a helmet?
Battle baller.
Yes. And I can see that, once or twice, but as the term throughout, that didn't quite ring true. It stops being slang and becomes something else.
I actually thought if we looked at this if we had a sort of a trope bingo, I actually thought it possibly scored oddly quite low. I mean, but Atkins was underage when he joined up. We do have a George type character who, my first action, old man, Ballygood show, but there's no poetry. There's not a lot of public skill. There's no unrequited homosexual love. A lot of highbrow First World War literature. None of those tropes are there.
Yeah, the tropes it's bringing in are pulling from pulp sci-fi rather than kind of First World War.
It's interesting because I think it's actually pulling on a lot of mid 20th century tropes. If you look at the way in which the war is written about in the 60s, 70s, 80s, up until Pat Barker. Pat Barker is sort of a turning point in some ways, and Blackadder as well in terms of but Blackadder doesn't have, I'd need to think about at what point in the 80s is the turning point, but there's a sort of working class tropes element to this that I think it's really drawing on that we're less familiar with now.
I wonder if he's aiming for an idea of a gritty reality, which is not always displayed. So at one point he has battle police preventing men from running away when the attack goes in. They just get shot if people are retreating. That doesn't appear usually in popular fiction, the idea that plucky Tommy might run away. Yeah, he's aiming for this sort of gritty reality. But
it did appear quite a lot in, the idea that the upper class officer shot you in the back to make you go forward, or that the working classes, that one turns up in Reginal Hill's The Wood Beyond, that the men shoot the officer in the back, the dislike, the awful lieutenant gets shot. That comes up quite a lot in that sort of mid to late 20th century history of the war. There are different types of tropes, and this felt true to a different set of tropes from the ones we've been looking at recently.
It would be really interesting to have this book on a reading list for like the war and literature it would be a very interesting book to teach with, or to set a class to read as a.
Don't. I'm not going to teach this in my cultural
Do it.
history
You know it makes sense.
class, because I'm not going to read it. I'm sorry. I got halfway through, and I cannot, in all justification, teach a book to students that I'm not going to finish myself.
I'm very aware that that possibly that my kind of enthusiasm for it is because, it very nicely ties into my sci-fi loves, and but it is so wildly, and I mean that kind of like in a sense of both like very different, but it is such a wild concept that makes it so different from a lot of the other books that we've read, that there's something just so kind of pleasingly appealing about it.
I enjoyed this sort of idea that there's a sort of almost an allegory to it being purgatory, because they arrive in a wonderful, beautiful paradise, and then suddenly the Germans are all replaced with mythical demons and plants that are trying to eat them.
I mean, again, without giving spoilers, but I remember this is that when you get to the third book, it turns out that the British weren't the only people who got transported from the Somme to Alien Nightmare World. Some Germans got picked up as well.
So no French?
Sadly not. Or at least not that I can remember.
We're still in a world war with two
yes,
two antagonists.
But they do talk about the Poilu. Get mentioned as a term and a concept which, warms my shriveled heart.
Maybe it's just I struggle with sci-fi in general, I have to say.
But it's found footage, it's real.
Yeah, this actually happened. Why do you hate the North Penier Fusiliers, Jessica?
There's some nice touches. I like I believe, I didn't double check it, but I think every chapter title is a line from a popular music hall song.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they are.
So I think that's the set of tropes we're working with, isn't it? It's Oh, What a Lovely War and A Long, Long Trail. That's the reference point, not Wilfred Owen and Robert Graves. So it's a different set of war reference points.
What's also interesting, and it's only kind of come to my mind more recently, if we jump from sci-fi to my other highbrow love of computer games, is for a while I've been thinking that when people are making First World War computer games, actually, like, the horror genre is a very good home for First World War based games and topics, because it actually ties in. Again, it can tie in quite well. And there's actually just been a game released relatively recently, which is a First World War survival horror, and having a book like this, which kind of is both sci-fi and kind of on the sci-fi horror scale, there's bits of Alien and Predator in there, and that kind of element is an interesting, different approach to let's talk about the First World War.
Going back to last month, thinking about that was an approach. The war as horror, I don't think is. I thought its way of thinking about the war as horrifying and therefore part of the horror genre was more original than the book we discussed, The Warm Hand of Ghosts, that we discussed last month.
Yeah, what we were saying last week, it wasn't nearly creepy enough to really invoke horror.
This one is creepy enough, but I think there's too many. It's too much of a mashup, and in that sense, it being a war book, which is a genre in its own right? That's the whole setup. That premise gets lost in all the other genres that we're trying to deal with. The sci-fi, the horror, the devil worship, all of this stuff is in there. And it's sort of like, well, what am I supposed to be? Where am I finding the jokes?
One thing I would be really interested in doing, which I'm not going to do, just to be clear, because it says at one point exactly how many guys get teleported to Nightmare World, but then at various points, like a good number of named characters of that kind of original group of named soldiers get bumped off at various points, but a lot of red shirts of just random First World War soldiers in the background get killed. And I'd be very interested in actually adding up how many of them die to see how many are left.
And how many got transported in the first place?
Yeah, well, it says at the beginning how many, because they do a roll call of how many guys there are. But then, they go out foraging and a group of X number of people doesn't come back. So, well, that's 6. And then some bugs appear and then half a dozen people get killed. That's another 6. So it'd be interesting to actually see how the maths work out. Because if it ends up basically being a minibus worth of First World War soldier survivors, then it's going to be a real hard time on that planet.
There is a high body count and they're repeatedly attacked. And it's interesting that they end up, they maintain trench discipline, don't they? And keep rebuilding their trenches. And in the end, they decide to build their trenches in a square to create a fort rather than a fixed linear line. But they stick to that idea of trenches.
Yes, this is the defensive point, and this is our territory.
With a flagpole and the flag.
which brings us back to that question you asked earlier, Angus, about how good was the medical history side of it. They do have a casualty clearing station, which is not a field hospital. Hurrah! But it's also not a casualty clearing station. It's a first aid post.
There's quite a lot of first aid because the doctor's there, isn't he, all the time at work, especially when you get transported with his...
It's the doctor and the three women, right? The two nurses and the ambulance driver, and the padre to a certain extent, which is fine. But that's not a casualty clearing station. That's not what a casualty clearing station does. It is an aid post. Or a main dressing station. Yeah, probably a main dressing station, actually.
There were some fun bits at various points of, like, Chekhov's chlorine gas canisters and stuff like that, where things get mentioned in passing at some point, a couple of scenes beforehand, and then suddenly, actually, oh God, the gas canisters have exploded. Or, oh no, don't worry, I've got this flamethrower that I found. Which is, again, it's very tropey, but it's quite pulpy tropey. In that sense of it's Sherlock Holmes noticing something and then on the wall and then using it 3 chapters down the line.
That's the whole. There's a mention about something about gods and the chat being afraid of a god, and then next minute the tank arrives and they fear that the tank is the god from the underworld somehow. Is it the god from the? I did make a note on that, but yes. It gets mentioned, he arrives. Thankfully, the tank could be, mistaken as a god so they can all retreat.
Yeah. Run away and it's fine.
Yeah. I did wonder what the purpose of the sort of tank was. Because the tank got transported, I sat all the way through. I think there's a purpose for this tank being here, but I'm not sure what it is.
It's also a major plot point in the second book. So the second book is called The Ironclad Prophecy, and I'm pretty sure that's all about the tank has gone out somewhere and disappeared. We have to go and find the tank. Like
Hollywood, they have limitless amounts of ammunition as well.
Yeah, they do a lot of 5 rounds rapid fire. I'm not expecting supplies anytime soon. So maybe 3 rounds rapid fire?
Given that they keep on having to forage.
Yeah, but from a logistics point of view, at least they make it clear that we can get fuel for the tank and the plane from fermenting alien juices from plants.
Yeah, Chris Phillips would be delighted on that aspect. They're squaring away some of those supply issues.
But no railway lines.
No railway lines. So... read at your own risk, Chris.
Did you notice as well? They slip into the narrative, especially into the speech, odd statements referred to sort of wartime propaganda. So at one point, one of the characters says, "Oh, we'll put the kibosh on the Khyber," which I thought was quite funny.
Yeah, they talk about the rape of Belgium at one point.
Did we turn our backs on Belgium when she pleaded for our aid? Say, I'm not sure which of the officers was trying to give his pep talk.
I mean, I think clearly very familiar with the language, because the naming of things, they did something when they go out and the plants that spike 2 of them, and I can't remember what they called them, something that was a very good pun, but a very good pun if you know the language, or not, or just the language of First World War objects and things. At one point, they name the. Do they name the trenches?
Yeah, there is mention of names of trenches,
and I had a slight problem with that because it talks about them as naming them after very local places, which doesn't take into effect the rotation of troops through the front line. Because you did have Piccadilly Circus, but that's because it's Piccadilly Circus, not because the London Regiment was there. I don't think a sector would have had local trench names to the extent that's implied. I think they would have been more generic about the dangers being run. Hellfire Corner is the obvious one, or Piccadilly Circus, because everybody would know that Piccadilly Circus is very crowded, rather than the Shambles or something if you're a Yorkshire regiment.
It's odd. Is it perhaps odd that we have a book with such a setting? I'm trying to think what when you look at First World War literature, I'm trying to think, what is there anything else that takes you away to such as a cosmic horror, pulpy, sci-fi setting? We've looked at other things that have allude to the war in the background, but in this, the war is there all around, but it transports it elsewhere. And I'm not sure that occult horror in the First World War, why it's often one. It has occurred to me in the past why role-playing games, for instance, don't use the First World War as a backdrop. Yeah, they will use the Second World War, especially sort of Lovecraftian, but not the First World War. And I'm not sure why. You know, the whole occult thing with the Germans in the Second World War seems to wrap it, but it's not a First World War setting usually.
No, which is interesting because as we were as we said last week and in previous weeks, you know, there is a significant interest in the occult during the First World War and so it actually could be a very, very useful and interesting setting for this type of thing. But you're right, I can't think of anything similar.
I wonder if it feels too close to art imitating life, because the 1920s did see a rise in the occult. And that is Aleister Crowley's, you know, sort of big moment, right? Part of the Sandman, part of the setup for the Sandman, I have a feeling references the First World War in terms of the capturing. I'd have to go back. What I abandoned this for was to read Shrines of Gaiety, Kate Atkinson's not most recent book, because she just published a new one, but previous book, which is set in the 1920s in Clubland. My main critique of that is that the society she sets up doesn't actually feel specifically 1920s. It feels more fin de siècle, so more 1890s. In sort of the atmosphere that she evokes, which isn't to say it wasn't true of the 1920s. It's and she's got quite a good description of some of the Bright Young Things parties, but just the overall atmosphere. And I wonder if some of the occult suffers from that to a certain extent. The Susan Hill Woman in Black image of the late 19th century occultism sort of overtakes the First World War in a way that isn't quite true of the Second World War.
So I've just been listening to, and I can't recall what it's called, but it's basically a rewriting of Sherlock Holmes with H.P. Lovecraft's cosmic horror in the background, and that partly transports Watson back to Afghanistan and inserts sort of a whole Cthulhu mythos adventure for Watson in Afghanistan, and it works very well, you know, because it's wonderfully nonsense, and Holmes is there, and you can sort of see all that working in the background with the occultism and things, and it's perhaps much more difficult to insert it onto the Western Front, which is why, you know, Lieutenant Jeffreys has to have his dugout on his own. Perhaps communal living does not lend itself to sort of these strange
to nefarious god worshipping.
Yeah, indeed. Whereas if you've got drawing rooms with closed windows, closed curtains, they can carry on unseen. And perhaps it's easier to compartmentalise things like that for the Second World War, where it is more about small unit actions. It is, you know, it's about a different sort of war than how the First World War was perceived.
There's also, and this is back to role playing, right? You know, how do you, and thinking about the sort of living history elements, how do you role play the Western Front when a lot of it is sitting around in a trench?
Well, I've seen living history people who have literally sat about in a trench all day reliving the First World War, but in fact, it was a dry trench on a 30-degree day with the fire engine pumping in water to try and make it muddy.
That's when I want to send them all the diary entries of blazing hot day, very glad for a dip in a river, that you do get quite a lot of.
We've not converted to this whole cosmic horror pulp genre then?
No, I still am quite keen, coming out of this, I'm still quite keen for Ben Aronovich to write the First World War origins of Thomas Nightingale. Serious occult horror without the sci-fi element, I think I would definitely read. As I say, I kept longing for a bit of H.G. Wells and philosophical sci-fi or horror. I do some Lovecraftian stuff, you know, as long as it sticks to Lovecraft. But so the other thing I didn't manage to finish in my summer holiday reading was Juno Dawson's Her Majesty's Secret Coven, which again is in this genre of witches in the real world. So witchcraft, magic, occult, I'd absolutely go for. The sci-fi bit yeah, I wasn't so captured by it, I'm afraid. But that's very much a personal taste.
I have to say, as Rebellion owns the copyright, as you point out, Chris, I do tend to think it would make quite a fun comic strip. I could see it running as a strip in 2000 AD. And I did wonder if it had almost been written as a comic strip, and they'd said, actually, we'll make it into a book and see how that goes. Because I think it would work in 2000 AD as a standalone strip over, running over a number of series.
Even a graphic novel actually could work because the otherworldly creatures are very visual, right?
Yeah, which would work really well. And then if you blend it with like Tardy style, it would be absolutely horrifying. Just traumatizing and depressing horror.
What are we recommending to our listeners?
I think we need to find some First World War occult horror. See if we can best this with.
I know I've got a friend called Josh Reynolds who writes occult horror, so he may well have done some of him himself. I'm pretty sure it was him who recommended these books to me to begin with. So I'll check in with him to see if he can recommend us some occult horror,
or if any of our listeners have any recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, I quite enjoyed the sort of Brian Lumliness of it all, rather than I think I find H.P. Lovecraft slightly tedious, but I tend to think those people who build on his work do it much better. And Brian Lumley, being a British writer, seems to set the scene quite well, and I felt it dropped into that quite nicely. That sort of setup.
Also, those who kind of take Lovecraft's kind of foundation starting points and then create something new on it also tend to remove a lot of the just awful racism that is throughout some of Lovecraft's stuff. It's like, oh, I don't even know if this aged well at the time, but it definitely hasn't now.
Yeah, I think this is a genre we certainly need to revisit.
Although, can I make a plea for a slight break? I think we are doing something slightly different next time, aren't we?
Well, yes. Well, shall we move on? What we had two potential things in the can. Do we know where we're going next, Chris?
So I think we need to sort out a date for recording, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be Greg Jenner coming to talk to us.
That's right. Yes, we do need to sort out a date.
And for those people not familiar with Greg Jenner.
So he presents and works on the very popular podcast, You're Dead to Me, which is a kind of like a comedic examination. It's a historian and a comedian discuss a moment of history. But he was also one of the people who worked on the Horrible Histories TV show. And he's, kind of comedian writer.
He writes histories of popular culture as well. So I think we're talking less about the First World War perhaps than we are talking about history in popular culture.
Yeah. And how they went about, constructing things like Horrible Histories to get the history in and to make it funny. And yeah, so I think we need to get a date in the diary for that.
And then our fallback is Supernatural War. Owen Davies.
Well, I've got a long shot for us, which is really for Chris and his love of 37 Days, which is Robert Harris has a new book about the origins of the First World War out. It's the relationship between Herbert Asquith and Venetia. I cannot remember her surname.
Is this a work of fiction?
It is. So yeah, that came out last week. So it might be worth contacting the publisher and see if we could at least get review copies.
That explains why the other day I saw, and I didn't click on it because it whizzed past, some story about Henry Asquith's having sex in his car with his mistress.
Yep, that's it.
A sex scandal from 100 years ago. I'm not sure this is breaking news.
And well, for the First World War historian, the real scandal is he apparently used to throw the diplomatic cables out the car window for sort of anyone to pick up.
Oh, Jesus.
So this is Precipice by Robert Harris.
So anyway, I think just so that Chris can talk once again about the Emperor Palpatine appearing.
Yeah. On the surface, that book will be about that episode will be about Precipice by Robert Harris. In reality, it's going to be me talking about Ian McDiarmid, and everybody else is just going to have to live with it.
Anyway, it occurred to me that might be something we can do.
Any other final thoughts? I have to say, I thought I forgot the name of the blooming book. Whatever it's called, Black Hand Gang. Absolute rubbish. I absolutely loved it.
Yep, that pretty much. I mean, I didn't absolutely love it, but That very much a matter of personal taste. I can see why you might love it.
It was just cobblers. And I read it on holiday, and I just, it was great. It was perfect for doing nothing and flicking through.
I think I ate it up in a day. It's very readable. It does just whiz past.
Yeah, I struggled. That was the thing. I found myself page counting, and that's usually a sign that I'm not finding it very readable. Anyway, I went and read Georgette Heyer after that, so, thank you, Vanda. Yeah.
We'll let Vanda know.
Well, so as we drift, shall we leave it there?
Lovely.
Sounds good to me.
Lovely. Right, until next time. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.